The shotgun was frozen to his hands. Not metaphorically, the metal of the barrel had conducted the cold of the Texas night so completely into his palms that removing his grip would have meant leaving skin behind. He had been sitting on the box of the Concord coach for 11 hours. The temperature had dropped 40 degrees since they left San Antonio. The norther had arrived without the warning he had hoped for, the sky closing from the northwest in a wall of grey that absorbed the horizon and kept coming. And now the wind was driving sleet horizontally across the road, if road was still the word for what lay beneath the wheels, which it barely was. Somewhere behind him, inside the coach, 6 passengers were generating what warmth 6 human bodies could produce in a wooden box. He was generating none. He was watching the dark tree line on both sides of the road through eyes narrowed against the driven ice, because the cold was not the only thing out there, and he had not survived 9 years on the Texas routes by assuming that bad weather made the other dangers disappear. The stagecoach lines that operated across Texas in the 1870s are among the most romanticized elements of the American West and among the most fundamentally misunderstood. The romance concentrates on the wrong things, on speed, on drama, on the cinematic silhouette of the coach against a sunset sky. What it consistently fails to capture is the specific, grinding daily reality of what it meant to move people and mail across 800 miles of Texas terrain in every season, on schedules that did not accommodate weather, with equipment that was simultaneously the finest available and comprehensively inadequate to the demands placed on it. The men who guarded the coaches, who sat on the exposed box beside the driver in conditions that the passengers inside could not fully imagine, responsible for the safety of everything and everyone the vehicle carried, occupied one of the most demanding occupational positions in the American West of the period. And the winter version of that position was something that no summer traveler's account could adequately prepare a person for. Texas weather in the 1870s was, for travelers and transportation workers operating outside the shelter of permanent structures, a force of genuinely dangerous unpredictability. The state's geography created meteorological conditions that had no equivalent in the experience of most people who arrived from the east, expecting something like the continental climate they knew. The Gulf of Mexico to the southeast fed moisture into the atmosphere in quantities that, when a cold front drove down from the north across the flat plains, produced precipitation events of startling severity. The norther, the term used by Texans of the period for the cold fronts that swept the state with remarkable speed, could drop temperatures by 30 or 40 degrees in a matter of hours, transforming a mild afternoon into a dangerous night with a speed that outpaced the ability of people caught in the open to respond effectively. And the Texas stagecoach routes of the 1870s ran through open country almost exclusively, across terrain that offered minimal natural shelter and that, in winter conditions, became a landscape where exposure was a genuine mortal threat. The Butterfield Overland Mail Route, which had preceded the period's lines, had established the basic geography of Texas stagecoach travel, the long diagonal crossing from the northeast corner of the state to El Paso in the far west, threading through terrain that ranged from the post-oak country of East Texas through the rolling limestone hills of the central region and out across the increasingly arid and exposed terrain of West Texas. The 1870s lines that operated under various names and contracts across this geography were direct descendants of that route, carrying mail under government contract and passengers at fares that reflected the genuine cost and difficulty of the service. The stations that provided relay points every 12 to 15 miles, where horses were changed, where passengers could eat or rest briefly, and where the accumulated damage of the road could be partially addressed before the next segment, were the operational infrastructure without which no coach could have completed the route. In winter, they were also the only reliable sources of warmth in a landscape that provided none. A stagecoach guard in the 1870s Texas system was not simply an armed escort hired to look threatening. The position required a specific combination of competence domains that very few individuals possessed in full, and the men who built sustained careers at it were, by any reasonable measure, exceptional human beings operating at the edge of what was sustainably possible. The firearms proficiency that the position obviously required was the most visible element, but arguably not the most demanding. More fundamentally challenging was the physical endurance the work required, the ability to remain alert and functionally capable through shifts that regularly extended to 12 and 14 hours on the box, in conditions that ranged from summer heat that made the metal of the coach too hot to touch to winter cold that made every exposed surface a threat to skin. And more demanding still was the specific judgment the position required, the continuous assessment of threat and terrain and weather, and the condition of the coach and horses and passengers that produced the decisions that kept everyone alive. Where are you watching this from right now? Drop it in the comments below. Whether you're somewhere in Texas yourself or watching from the other side of the country, we want to hear from you. The physical preparation that experienced guards developed for winter operations on Texas routes was built from years of learning what the cold actually did to a human body over extended exposure, and from the specific adaptations that made the difference between a man who arrived at the next station functional and one who arrived in crisis. Layering was the foundational principle, applied with more sophistication than the term suggests. The outermost layer, typically a heavy buffalo hide coat or a buffalo robe of the kind that the hide trade was producing in enormous quantities during the 1870s, served as both insulation and wind barrier, and its specific properties made it better suited to Texas winter conditions than any alternative available. Buffalo hide retained warmth even when wet, a property that wool shared but that most other available materials did not. And on a Texas route where sleet and freezing rain were recurrent winter hazards, this property was not a luxury feature, but an operational necessity. Beneath the buffalo robe, experienced guards layered wool, multiple garments rather than one heavy piece, because the air trapped between layers insulated more effectively than any single thickness of material could. The principle was well understood by practical experience, even without the thermodynamic theory that explained it, and men who had spent winters on the box without adequate layering and then spent subsequent winters with it had a visceral, embodied understanding of the difference that required no scientific explanation. Wool undergarments against the skin, wool shirt, wool vest, wool jacket, buffalo robe on top. This was the standard assembly of a guard who intended to arrive at his destination with all his fingers intact. Feet received similar attention because foot loss to frostbite was a documented occupational hazard of winter coach travel, and a guard who lost toes to cold was a guard who could no longer do the work. Multiple wool socks, tall boots with the best insulation available, and where resources permitted, additional wrapping of the feet and lower legs in strips of wool blanket material before the boots went on. These were the practices of men who had learned the hard way what insufficient foot protection meant. Hands presented the most persistent challenge because the requirements of the position were directly in conflict with the requirements of hand protection. Keeping hands warm enough to maintain dexterity required insulation that, when thick enough to be effective in genuine cold, also reduced the fine motor control needed to handle a firearm effectively. Guards resolved this conflict through various compromises. Mittens with a separate trigger finger compartment that could be folded back for shooting, keeping one hand in a coat pocket while the other remained on the shotgun and rotating them periodically. Positioning the hands against the body's warmest areas during quiet periods to restore circulation before returning them to exposure. None of these solutions was fully satisfactory. All of them were better than the alternative. The frozen hands of the man on the box in the opening of this story were the product of a night that had exceeded the capacity of all available solutions. A night when the cold was simply worse than the preparation for it could fully address. The Concorde coach itself, the vehicle that the best Texas lines operated during the period, was a piece of engineering that represented the highest achievement of American coach-building technology, and it was still fundamentally inadequate to the demands of winter travel across Texas terrain. The coach's suspension system, which used leather thoroughbraces rather than metal springs to absorb road shock, was genuinely innovative and significantly more effective at managing the continuous vibration of rough road travel than any spring-based alternative of the period. Its body, constructed from carefully selected and seasoned hardwoods, was strong and relatively light. Its interior, which could carry 6 to 9 passengers in conditions of considerable intimacy, generated meaningful warmth from human body heat when fully occupied. None of these virtues addressed the fact that the driver and guard sat on an exposed wooden box at the front of the vehicle, fully exposed to whatever weather the Texas sky was producing, with no shelter and no heat source, and no alternative to sitting there for as long as the route demanded. The horses that pulled the coaches were central characters in the winter survival equation, and their management under cold conditions was a domain of expertise that the best drivers and the guards who worked closely with them understood with a completeness that reflected the operational dependence of the entire enterprise on the animal's well-being. Cold weather affected horses in ways that experienced operators had learned to manage through practice. Cold muscles required longer warm-up periods before demanding full performance. A team pushed hard immediately from a cold station stop was a team at elevated risk of pulled muscles or other injury, which in remote country meant a coach stopped in conditions where stopping was dangerous. Horses working hard in cold air required more feed than they needed in mild weather, because maintaining body temperature consumed energy that would otherwise be available for the work of pulling. And horses that had been sweated from hard work and then stood at a cold station while the relay was prepared were at risk of the chilling that could progress to dangerous illness if they were not actively managed during the stop. Guards who understood horses, and the best of them understood horses very well, because working alongside drivers for years produced an education in equine management that was practically comprehensive, participated in this management not as a formal duty, but as a natural extension of the operational awareness that kept the entire system functioning. A guard who noticed that one of the horses in the team was showing the specific stiffness of cold-induced muscle tightening and communicated this to the driver before it became a problem was doing his job in a broader sense than the narrow definition of the position implied. The shotgun was the most visible tool of his trade. Observation and judgment were the most valuable ones. If this kind of deep history is doing something for you, if you're learning things you never found in a textbook, share this video with someone right now. The more people who find content like this, the more we can keep making it. The threat landscape that winter conditions modified rather than eliminated was the permanent backdrop against which all other survival calculations were made. The stagecoach routes of 1870s Texas crossed territory that was genuinely contested, not in the abstract political sense, but in the immediate operational sense that armed parties with hostile intent toward coaches and their contents operated in the same territory through which the coaches ran, and the weather that made the guards' physical situation miserable did not reliably make those parties less active. In some respects, it made them more dangerous, because the assumption that bad weather would reduce threat led to the kind of relaxed vigilance that experienced guards resisted in themselves and watched for in younger men. The ambush that succeeded in winter was often the one that counted on the cold, making the guard's attention drift inward, toward his own discomfort, toward the management of frozen hands and reduced circulation, rather than outward toward the road ahead and the tree line on either side. The specific geography of winter ambush differed from summer in ways that experienced guards catalogued and maintained as operational knowledge. Creek crossings were more dangerous in winter not only because of the ice and mud that complicated the physical crossing, but because the terrain features that made them choke points: the narrowing of the road, the requirement for reduced speed, the noise of the water and the coach masking other sounds remained fully present, while the vegetation that would have provided some visual warning of concealed parties was reduced. The bare trees of a Texas winter drew the eye less effectively than summer foliage, but actually provided less concealment, a fact that cut both ways, reducing some ambush opportunities while eliminating others. Guards who had worked the routes through multiple winters developed a specific mental map of which locations were more or less dangerous in cold weather than in warm, and they applied that knowledge in the form of heightened attention at specific points in the route, rather than a uniform level of vigilance that would have been unsustainable over a 14-hour shift. The relationships between guards and the station keepers who maintained the relay infrastructure were another dimension of winter survival that the romantic accounts consistently undervalue. Station keepers on the Texas routes of the 1870s occupied positions of sustained hardship that rivaled or exceeded that of the men on the box in certain respects. They were permanently stationed in remote locations that combined isolation with the constant operational demands of maintaining horses, facilities, and food supplies in conditions that supply disruptions and weather events regularly complicated. What they provided to guards and drivers arriving at their stations in winter conditions was not merely fresh horses and a meal. It was the specific intelligence about road conditions ahead, about weather developments observed from a fixed position over the preceding hours, about any unusual activity in the surrounding territory, that informed the decisions the coach crew would make over the next leg of the route. A station keeper who had watched a norther building from the northwest all afternoon and could describe its apparent intensity and direction to an arriving crew was providing operational information of genuine value, and the informal networks through which this intelligence moved along the routes were as important to winter survival as any physical equipment. Food and water management on winter Texas runs presented challenges that summer operation had not prepared new guards for, and that veteran guards had developed specific practices to address. The human body's caloric requirement increases significantly in cold conditions because maintaining core temperature consumes energy that must be replaced. A guard sitting on the box for 12 hours in genuine cold was burning substantially more energy than the same man sitting in the same position on a mild day, and the difference had to be compensated for in food intake, or it would be compensated for by the body drawing on reserves that, once depleted, compromised both physical function and cognitive performance. Guards who understood this ate heavily before a winter run and carried additional food, typically dense, calorie-rich items that did not freeze into inedibility at low temperatures, hard tack biscuits, dried meat, fat in various forms, in their coat pockets for consumption during the run itself. The practice of eating regularly during a shift rather than waiting for station stops was not gluttony. It was physiology, applied by men who understood their body's requirements under specific conditions. Water presented the opposite problem, not insufficient intake, but the management of a liquid that froze. A canteen of water on the box in a Texas norther was a canteen of ice within an hour, and a guard who needed water, and in cold, dry air, the body's need for hydration continued even when the sensation of thirst was reduced by the cold, had to have either stored water in a location where body heat kept it liquid or accepted that melting snow or ice from available sources was the alternative. Experienced guards used both strategies, keeping a small flask inside the innermost layer of clothing where body heat maintained it in liquid form regardless of exterior temperature, and supplementing from environmental sources at opportunities. The discipline of maintaining hydration in cold conditions, when the body's thirst signals were unreliable and the act of producing liquid required effort, was another element of winter survival that distinguished the experienced practitioner from the novice. Tell us in the comments, what's something about the American frontier that you thought you knew, but this video is making you see differently? We genuinely read every response, and your engagement keeps this channel going. The specific dangers of the West Texas portion of the routes, the long exposed stretches between the hill country and El Paso that the 1870s lines had to cross, deserve particular attention because they represented the most demanding segment of the winter operation and the one where the combination of cold, distance, and hostile threat was most concentrated. The terrain west of the Pecos River in winter was a landscape of a severity that travelers who knew only East Texas found genuinely shocking. The elevation increased, the vegetation thinned, and the wind, unimpeded by any significant topographic barrier, moved across the high desert at speeds that drove the wind chill into ranges where exposed skin could be damaged within minutes. Water sources in this country were sparse in summer and potentially frozen in winter, creating a planning requirement for the coach operation that had no equivalent in the more watered eastern portions of the route. Horses needed water at intervals that the distances between reliable sources sometimes made difficult to meet, and a team that was simultaneously cold, working hard, and inadequately watered was a team whose performance degradation would eventually produce a crisis. The Comanche and Kiowa raiding that represented one of the primary security threats along the northern portions of the Texas routes was seasonal in ways that created both reductions and increases in specific threat types through the winter period. Winter weather reduced the frequency of large raiding parties. The logistical demands of moving a significant mounted force in cold conditions were real constraints that reduced the operational tempo of large-scale raiding. But smaller parties, and specifically the opportunistic attacks that required minimal organization and offered maximum flexibility to abort if conditions were unfavorable, continued through the winter, and in some stretches of the route were actually more frequent in cold months, when reduced coach traffic made individual coaches more isolated, and the assumption of lighter guard presence was sometimes acted upon. A guard on a winter run could not assume that reduced overall threat meant no threat, and the mental discipline required to maintain genuine vigilance through 12 hours of cold on a route that had been quiet for weeks was among the more demanding psychological challenges the position presented. The recovery from a winter run, the hours after arriving at the destination station when the accumulated cold and fatigue of the shift had to be addressed before the next departure, was a process that experienced guards managed with the same systematic attention they applied to the run itself. Rewarming had to be gradual because rapid rewarming of extremities that had been significantly chilled produced pain and could contribute to the tissue damage that was the outcome of frostbite progressing to actual freezing. The practice of removing boots and warming feet slowly rather than immediately placing them near the fire was standard knowledge among men who had seen what aggressive rewarming did to previously frostbitten tissue. Food, sleep, and the specific attention to any injuries or developing illnesses that the cold had produced were the priorities of the recovery period, balanced against the scheduled demands of a transportation system that operated on timelines that treated human recovery needs as constraints to be managed rather than conditions to be fully accommodated. The role of experience in winter survival on the Texas stagecoach routes cannot be overstated, and the transmission of that experience from veteran guards to newer men was a process that happened through apprenticeship rather than formal instruction, through the specific observations and corrections that an experienced man on the box could provide to a newer partner over the course of a winter season, building a practical curriculum from the actual conditions of the actual route. A new guard working his first Texas winter alongside a man who had worked the same route for 6 years was in the presence of a body of operational knowledge that no other source could have provided. Knowledge of specific road segments, specific weather patterns, specific threat patterns, specific horse behaviors, specific equipment failures, and how to manage them. That represented the accumulated intelligence of hundreds of runs under conditions spanning the full range of what Texas winter could produce. This experiential transmission was the mechanism through which the stagecoach industry of the 1870s maintained its operational capability in the face of conditions that, by any objective measure, should have made it unsustainable. The coaches ran because men who knew how to run them trained the next generation of men who would know how to run them, passing forward through direct human contact the specific knowledge that kept the system functioning. When experienced men were lost, to violence, to injury, to the alternative employment that the rapidly changing economy of 1870s Texas increasingly offered, the knowledge they carried was lost with them unless it had been successfully transmitted, and the gaps it left were felt in the performance of the lines they had served. The broader social context of the Guards' existence, their position in the communities through which the routes passed, the relationships they maintained with the passengers they protected, and the station keepers they depended on, and the drivers they worked beside, was a human dimension of the occupation that the narrow focus on physical survival can obscure. Guards who worked the same routes for years became known figures in the towns and stations they passed through regularly, their competence and reliability assessed by the communities that depended on the mail and passenger service they protected. A guard with a reputation for steady performance in difficult conditions was a figure of genuine local standing, his opinion sought on matters of road conditions and security and weather that fell within his specific expertise. The informal social economy of reputation and trust that operated across the Stagecoach network was a form of professional capital that the best guards accumulated over years of consistent performance, and it had real value in a world where the difference between a reliable and an unreliable guard was sometimes the difference between arriving and not arriving. If you've stayed with us this long, you're already the kind of viewer this channel exists for, curious, serious, genuinely interested in how the West actually worked, rather than how the movies said it did. Subscribe if you haven't already, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. The decline of the Texas stagecoach routes through the later 1870s and into the 1880s, driven primarily by the expansion of the railroad network that progressively connected the towns the coaches had been serving and offered a faster, more comfortable and cheaper alternative for both mail and passengers, changed the specific demands on the men who had built careers in the system without eliminating all of them immediately. The railroad's expansion was not uniform or simultaneous across the state, and the routes that connected communities not yet served by rail continued to operate, some of them for years after the main trunk lines had been established. For the guards who remained in the system as the railroad took its territory, the surviving routes were typically the most difficult ones, the segments too remote or too economically marginal to attract railroad investment, crossing terrain that the railroad had found impractical or too expensive. These were the routes where the original demands of the Texas Stagecoach Guard, the cold, the distance, the threat, the physical endurance, persisted in their most concentrated form even as the more accessible routes were handed over to the train. The men who had spent the 1870s on the box of Texas coaches carried in their bodies and their minds a specific form of knowledge about the Texas landscape and its winter conditions that was, in a very real sense, irreplaceable. They knew the road, not in the abstract geographic sense, but in the specific, granular, operationally useful sense of knowing which creek crossing became dangerous in a specific kind of freeze, which stretch of road lost its surface first in a norther, which hillside was exposed to the northwest wind in a way that made it significantly colder than the surrounding terrain, which station keeper could be relied upon for accurate weather intelligence, and which one tended toward optimism that the conditions did not support. This knowledge was not written down. It lived in the men who had accumulated it through years of direct experience, and it was transmitted to the next generation through the apprenticeship of working together on the box through the winters that produced it. The frozen hands gripping the shotgun, the sleet driving horizontal across the road, the darkness on both sides where the tree line could be concealing anything. These were the specific contents of a winter night on the Texas routes, and they were the contents of dozens of such nights for any man who built a career in the system. The survival that resulted from those nights was not luck, not heroism in the cinematic sense, not the product of some exceptional individual quality that set these men apart from ordinary humanity. It was the product of specific knowledge, applied systematically in conditions that tested the application continuously and rewarded it inconsistently but often enough to make the work survivable. The men who rode the winter routes of 1870s Texas were professionals in the fullest sense of the word, people who had developed genuine expertise in a genuinely demanding field and who applied that expertise with the consistency that distinguished professional performance from occasional competence. The temperature had stopped dropping somewhere around midnight. The guard on the box noticed the change, not from any thermometric measurement, but from the specific quality of the air against his face. A subtle shift from the sharp bite of active cold to something slightly less aggressive, the norther having reached whatever equilibrium point the night's weather system was settling into. Another 4 hours to the next station. The horses were holding their pace. The road ahead, visible in the coach lantern's reach, showed nothing that required immediate response. He shifted the shotgun to his left hand and worked the fingers of his right slowly inside his coat, forcing blood back into tissue that had been asking for it for longer than was comfortable. Then the right hand went back to the gun, and the left hand went inside and did the same. 4 hours. He had done 4 hours before. He would do it again. You made it all the way through, and that tells us everything about the kind of audience this channel is building. Leave a comment below and tell us what surprised you most about how these men actually lived and worked. And if you know someone who loves real American frontier history, send them this video right now. Stories this specific deserve to be heard.